The mystery of Easter Island has captivated explorers, archaeologists, and dreamers for centuries. Standing tall against the horizon, nearly 900 stone sentinels have silently watched over this remote Pacific outpost for over 500 years. But what if everything we thought we knew about these monolithic guardians was wrong? What if the story of Easter Island isn't a cautionary tale of environmental collapse, but something far more complex and perhaps more human? Today, we're diving into the untold story of the Moai statues and the remarkable civilization that created them. We'll separate fact from fiction, myth from reality, and reveal how a narrative of ecological suicide masked a darker truth about colonialism, resilience, and cultural survival. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as it's known to its indigenous people, sits in splendid isolation in the southeastern Pacific Ocean. It's one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass. This tiny volcanic island, barely 63 square miles in total, somehow became home to one of humanity's most impressive artistic and engineering achievements, the Moai. For decades, the prevailing narrative about Easter Island went something like this. A thriving Polynesian society arrived around 1200 CE, multiplied rapidly, and began carving massive stone statues to honor their ancestors. In their religious fervor, they cut down all their trees to transport these monoliths, triggering environmental collapse, warfare, and population crash. By the time European explorers arrived in 1722, they found a decimated landscape and a desperate, diminished people who had toppled their own statues in rage or despair. It's a compelling story, almost a parable for our own environmental anxieties. There's just one problem. Much of it isn't true. Recent archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence has dramatically reshaped our understanding of what actually happened on Rapa Nui. The real story begins around 800 1000 CE, when Polynesian voyagers first arrived on the island's shores. These weren't accidental castaways, but deliberate explorers, navigating by stars and currents in one of history's most impressive feats of maritime wayfinding. The island they discovered was not the tropical paradise often depicted in simplified accounts. Easter Island has always been marginal for agriculture. Its volcanic soil is nutrient poor, rainfall is unpredictable, and there were few native food plants. Yet the Rapa Nui people adapted brilliantly to these challenging conditions. They developed innovative farming techniques like lithic mulching, covering garden areas with stones to preserve moisture and protect plants from wind. They built thousands of manavai, stone-walled enclosures that created microclimates for growing crops. And contrary to popular belief, they practiced careful resource management of the island's limited palm forests. By around 1200 to 1300 CE, Rapa Nui society had flourished enough to begin the monumental task of carving and erecting the Moai. These weren't just random stone faces, but carefully crafted ancestral figures, each representing a specific lineage leader. The average Moai stands 13 feet tall and weighs 14 tons, but some reach nearly 33 feet and weigh up to 82 tons. All were carved from the volcanic tuff of Rano Raraku Quarry and then somehow transported, in some cases up to 11 miles, to ceremonial platforms called ahu around the island's perimeter. How did they move these massive statues without wheels, pulleys, or large draft animals? This question fueled wild speculation for centuries, from alien intervention to lost advanced technology. But experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the Rapa Nui people used a remarkably elegant solution. They made the Moai walk. Using a system of ropes and teams of workers, they rocked the statues from side to side in a controlled manner, gradually inching them forward along prepared roads. In 2012, researchers successfully demonstrated this technique with a replica Moai, moving it at a rate of about 100 meters per hour. The statues didn't need extraterrestrial help. They needed human ingenuity and cooperation. This brings us to the first major misconception about Easter Island: the idea that statue building represented irrational religious fanaticism that drove ecological collapse. In reality, Moai construction was a sophisticated cultural practice that strengthened social cohesion. Different clans competed to build impressive ancestral monuments, but this competition took place within a sustainable framework of resource sharing and management. So, what about those vanished forests? Early European visitors described Easter Island as almost entirely treeless, and pollen records confirm that the island was once covered with palm forests similar to those found in Chile. Conventional wisdom held that the Rapa Nui people recklessly cut down all these trees to transport their stone obsessions. But here's where the story takes its first dramatic turn. In 2007, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo published groundbreaking research suggesting that humans weren't the primary cause of deforestation. The real culprit? The humble Polynesian rat, which arrived as a stowaway in the settlers' canoes. These prolific rodents found an evolutionary paradise on Easter Island. Abundant food, no predators, and palm nuts that were particularly vulnerable to rat consumption. Paleoenvironmental evidence shows that rat-gnawed palm nuts appear in the archaeological record immediately after human arrival, and the forest decline begins shortly thereafter. Computer models suggest that rats alone could have deforested the island within as little as 200 years. This doesn't mean humans played no role in environmental change. They certainly cut some trees for canoes, buildings, and yes, to help transport Moai. But the evidence increasingly suggests that the Rapa Nui people were practicing sustainable forestry until the rat population explosion overwhelmed the ecosystem's capacity to regenerate. What's particularly remarkable is how the islanders adapted to this changing landscape. As palm forests dwindled, they didn't descend into chaos. They innovated. They developed new agricultural techniques. They built windbreaks to protect crops from the increasingly exposed and windy conditions. They even created rock gardens that used stone fragments to protect plants and improve soil conditions. This brings us to the second major misconception: the idea that environmental stress led to warfare, population collapse, and the toppling of the Moai. For decades, archaeologists interpreted certain obsidian tools called mata as weapons, suggesting widespread conflict. But recent analysis shows these were more likely general-purpose cutting tools for everyday tasks. Similarly, the idea of a massive population crash before European contact isn't supported by the evidence. Archaeological surveys suggest the population was stable at around 3,000 to 4,000 people, a sustainable number for the island's carrying capacity. There was no evidence of mass starvation or warfare in the human remains from this period. So, why were the Moai toppled? Here we encounter the true tragedy of Easter Island. Not an ecological suicide, but a colonial catastrophe. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday 1722, he described a functioning society with standing Moai. But the island's isolation wouldn't protect it for long. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raiders descended on the island, capturing as many as 1,500 people, half the island's population, including the king, priests, and those who could read and write the indigenous Rongorongo script. Only a handful ever returned, bringing smallpox with them. Chilean annexation followed in 1888, with the remaining Rapa Nui people confined to a small settlement, while the rest of the island was converted to a sheep ranch. By 1877, only 111 indigenous people remained on the island. It was during this period of colonial devastation, not before, that most of the Moai were toppled. Some may have fallen in earthquakes, but archaeological evidence shows that many were deliberately pulled down during the late 18th and 19th centuries. This wasn't a case of cultural suicide, but rather cultural trauma inflicted by outside forces. The third major misconception about Easter Island is perhaps the most pernicious. The idea that the Rapa Nui people were passive victims of their own foolishness, rather than active agents adapting to challenging circumstances. This narrative conveniently absolved colonial powers of responsibility while portraying indigenous people as incapable of sustainable resource management. The truth is far more nuanced. The Rapa Nui people created a unique civilization in one of Earth's most isolated environments. They developed sustainable agricultural practices, managed limited resources, and created monumental art that still inspires awe today. When environmental conditions changed, partly due to introduced species like rats, they adapted their practices accordingly. What ultimately devastated their society wasn't internal collapse, but external contact: disease, slavery, land appropriation, and cultural suppression. The story of Easter Island isn't a simple morality tale about environmental hubris, but a complex history of human resilience, adaptation, and ultimately, colonial impact. This revised understanding has profound implications. For one, it challenges the notion that indigenous societies are inherently prone to environmental mismanagement. The Rapa Nui people maintained a stable, sustainable society for centuries under challenging conditions. Their eventual decline came not from within, but from without. It also reminds us to question simplified narratives, especially those that conveniently align with contemporary concerns. The ecological collapse story gained traction partly because it resonated with modern environmental anxieties. While these concerns are valid, projecting them onto past societies can distort our understanding of history. Perhaps most importantly, this new perspective restores agency to the Rapa Nui people themselves. Rather than passive victims of their own folly, they emerge as innovative problem solvers who created remarkable cultural achievements despite limited resources. Their descendants today continue this legacy of resilience, working to preserve their language, traditions, and the remarkable Moai that have become symbols of their identity. The Moai themselves remain enigmatic. Why do some wear red stone hats called pukau? Why do certain statues face inland while most look out to sea? What is the significance of the kneeling Moai known as tukuturi, so different from its standing counterparts? These questions continue to drive archaeological research and cultural interpretation. What's clear is that the Moai were never mere stone idols, but embodiments of ancestral mana or spiritual power. They connected the living community with their ancestors, reinforcing social cohesion and cultural identity. Even as the physical environment changed, this spiritual landscape provided continuity and meaning. Today, Easter Island faces new challenges. Tourism has become the main economic driver, bringing both opportunities and pressures. Rising sea levels threaten coastal Ahu, where many Moai stand. The small indigenous population, now around 3,000 people, struggles to maintain cultural traditions while participating in a globalized economy. Yet the spirit of innovation and adaptation that characterized their ancestors continues. Modern Rapa Nui people are actively involved in archaeological research, cultural preservation, and sustainable development initiatives. They're reclaiming their history from outsider narratives and asserting their role as stewards of their island's remarkable heritage. The true lesson of Easter Island isn't about ecological collapse, but about resilience in the face of adversity, both environmental and colonial. It's about the remarkable achievements possible even in the most isolated circumstances. And it's about the importance of listening to indigenous perspectives rather than imposing external narratives. The next time you see those iconic stone faces, remember, they don't represent the failure of a civilization, but its enduring strength. They stand not as warnings, but as witnesses to human creativity, to cultural persistence, and to a history far more complex than we once believed. The Moai have kept their silent vigil for centuries. Perhaps it's time we listen to what they're really telling us.